calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
I'm here in snowy Chicago. We have
You have snow? Oh, it's
two
like 60
inches
here.
of snow.
Wow.
Are you sure you're Chris Anderson? Because you're wearing something
What
that
is-
I really very rarely see Chris Anderson wear.
This is my Christmas tie, my lovely present from my daughter Madeline. So I thought I would display it. And you are looking dapper as well, Rick.
I have a new vest, trying to up my History Happy Hour game and be more like my hero, Christopher J. Anderson. So that's what that's all about, you know.
Okay.
But I want to say Happy New Year to everybody, all
Yes.
of our viewers, and happy to have you back in 2022, the third calendar year of History Happy Hour. And whoever would have thought that
guessed,
something like
yes.
this would have happened. And Chris, we should shout out to our Patreon supporters as well.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, can you pop up the list for us?
Yeah.
It's growing, and we appreciate that because you are the folks that make this all possible. So,
And this is
great
just our
deal of
top
thanks.
shelf patrons. We
Yep.
have other patrons as well. So maybe we'll put all their names on one time as well,
Yes.
just to put the whole thing. But thank you everybody who supports
Thanks,
us, and you can do so via patreon.com/History Happy Hour. Okay, there's the fundraising portion of the program
Yes,
is now
right on.
over. Do you think we've reached the critical mass here, Chris,
I
where
think
we
so.
can get started?
I think so.
All right, give me the cue. The bar is open.
Yes.
What's
Well,
on tap?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited. We're going to be joined this evening by Patrick Bishop. Patrick is one of Great Britain's leading military historians. Before that, he was one of its most accomplished conflict journalists. He covered wars in the Falklands and Afghanistan. Since then, he's gotten into history. He's written scores of books. All of them are great. Three in particular about the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, and they are all Sunday Times bestsellers. But we're here now to talk about his new book on Operation Jubilee, the failed raid on Dieppe in 1942. So, very excited about that. So thank you
Patrick,
for joining
welcome.
us, Patrick.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Well, good. We hope you brought a suitable beverage to History Happy Hour.
Yes.
Okay.
There we go. Right.
Yeah.
You passed the
Happy
test.
New Year. That's
Happy,
right.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, talking about a subject like Dieppe, you probably need a drink.
Yeah, I figured I went for the Glenmorangie to have the most
Ooh.
fortified possible experience
Very nice.
during this.
Patrick, when I was reading the book, I came across this wonderful quote of General Percy Hobart, and he's writing to the British historian Basil Littlehart after the raid. And I'm sure most of our viewers know Hobart was a British armored officer who was kind of famous for developing some vehicles that were used on D-Day, but a soldier of long experience. And he's writing to Littlehart after the raid, and he says, "A raid is either to obtain information and destroy some worthwhile objective, or it is to train one's own troops. In the latter case, one would not select a strongly defended sector. In the former, what was the objective? Evidently, we did not reach it at all. It all sounds pretty Passchendaele to me." So, particularly for the benefit for American viewers who might not really be aware of kind of the horror of this whole operation, what was Dieppe and what was Percy kind of driving at there?
Well, I think it's interesting. He uses Passchendaele as a metaphor. And Passchendaele was already implanted in everyone's minds as a synonym for pointless, bloody disaster. And that's exactly what Dieppe was, really. That's how it turned out to be. It was the first question was what actually was meant to happen at Dieppe. It was a large-scale raid involving huge numbers of airplanes, of ships, and about 6,000 to 7,000 men in an attack on a kind of not terribly important French port, the object of which was not to hold it or do anything with it, but just to get in there, smash the place up, and then leave again, hopefully with as many people departing as had arrived. It didn't work out like that at all. It was a kind of massacre from as soon as the first troops even got within 100 yards of the shore, they were getting killed by the very good shore defences. They never actually got anywhere into the town. They got onto the beaches around the town, where they were spent about 4 or 5 hours being systematically slaughtered before they were taken up again. So it's a kind of enormous mystery, which I think even with my best efforts, I think I've made a good attempt at clearing up the questions that Hobart asks, and the answers are really, it's a kind of classic example of the sort of military blundering that happens at all times, but particularly in war, and particularly at certain phases of the war. And I think to understand what happened there, you've got to really understand where it is in the course of the war. So I think you've got to see it first and foremost, not as a military exercise, but as a political and propaganda exercise. And I think for that reason, judgments were made, which, if they were being made in a purely simple military calculation, would have been rejected. They would never have gone ahead. But because of the political pressures coming from all directions, from up and down, from across the Atlantic and across the Urals, from Moscow to Washington, things were done which meant that military common sense was not the prime consideration.
You put that very politely, I gotta say.
So when you look at the time, it's August 1942. America has come into the war 6 or 7 months earlier, and there's some effort to do stuff or talk about operations in the future that might take place. You have Russia being battered in the second year of an offensive, second offensive by the Nazis, and so why? And you have a man named Lord Mountbatten, who's head of combined operations that's doing some smaller scale raids. Why is this? What about the politics then, as you suggest, might be driving the Dieppe Raid?
Well, this is a kind of really interesting point in the war where there's the first act is over, really. You've got Britain has been fighting the war more or less on its own, and it's been suffering defeat after defeat. It's had one great success, which of course is the Battle of Britain, where they do actually pull off a magnificent victory, which makes the invasion of Britain an impossibility, really, for the Germans. But before that, it's been disaster. After that, it's disaster. On the land, nothing is going well at all. North Africa, there are a few kind of minor successes against Italian troops, it has to be said. And so Britain really is kind of trying to catch its breath and see what it does next. And there's a huge change, of course, in the grand strategy of the war, which is that the Americans are now in the war, and we've now got this alliance of Soviet Union, America, and Britain, a very unlikely alliance, ideological enemies, all combined with a existential need to destroy Nazism. But the British are the kind of the Americans are looking to the British to say, okay, we're in the war now. What do we do next? And the Brits say, well, you've got to bide your time now. This is not the time to actually be doing anything rash. But on the other hand, the Russians are saying, we're getting hammered on the Eastern Front. You have to do something to help us. And this is a point of view that the Americans very much sympathize with. Plus, there's a certain amount of impetuosity on the American side, where they say, okay, we're in it now, let's get on with it, let's do something, let's invade Northern Europe, not in way down the road. The Brits haven't even given a date for when they think D-Day should happen. But the Americans are saying, well, why don't we do something this year? So the Brits, having pulled off this fantastic feat of getting the Americans into the war, are now thinking, oh, okay, so far so good, but now we've got to try and sort of damp down all the enthusiasm we've spent all this time stoking up. They were completely, of course, the Brits were completely right to say that they weren't in any position to actually launch an invasion in 1942. But they had to be seen to be doing something. So Dieppe takes on this massive significance that it otherwise wouldn't have had. It's all, if you just look at it independently of those grand strategic considerations, it's just another in a sequence of raids that have been going on since the end of 1941. which are really kind of, again, they're kind of propaganda, morale-boosting exercises. An amphibious force goes ashore in occupied Europe, smashes the place up, sometimes with effects that can actually be said to actually contribute to the war effort. So a good example is the raid on Saint-Nazaire, which was one of those ports on the Atlantic side, which had a huge dock, the dock where a great ocean-going liner, the Normandy, was built in the 1930s. So it's a great facility, which, if the Tirpitz, which is the only remaining battleship in the German fleet, actually broke out into the Atlantic, the only place it could actually be serviced and repaired, or the rest of it, was in this dock, the Normandy dock, as it's called. So this was a very, very daring raid at the end of March 1942, where a combined force of commandos, lots of very skillful and experienced naval personnel, and a bit of support from the RAF, go in, they destroy the dock, they do a fantastic job smashing the place up. So it has a kind of definite kind of tactical value. And then they retreat, and of course it looks fantastic. They've pulled off this very daring raid under the noses of Germans. They've got a definite result, and it boosts morale at a time when nothing is going well for the Brits. So Dieppe was kind of one of, there were loads of these things planned for the rest of the year. And Dieppe is just one on a list, but the others fall off the list for one reason or another. So they kind of left this one, which then gets loaded with all these political and strategic considerations, which drive it forward, even though of all the, well, there were lots of madcap schemes, but this was up there with the kind of top three crazy schemes that were on offer at the time.
Well, but Patrick, I mean, I again, particularly for Americans, central to this whole story is the figure of Lord Louis Mountbatten. And I mean, I might be sticking my neck out here by saying there's probably never been somebody to reach such dizzying heights that was less qualified for the job. Can you tell us a little bit about him and kind of how he's driving this forward? Because he really seems to be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. I mean, he's central to the whole thing. I think without Mountbatten, it would certainly never have happened without Mountbatten. And Mountbatten his personality infused the organisation that carried out the raids. It was called Combined Operations. And it was a very good idea. And it's the first attempt to actually put together a properly coherent, integrated command structure that actually combines the might of the three forces in an intelligent, concentrated, focused way. And he was a good man for doing that. He was a good leader. He had great leadership qualities. He had huge charisma. He had a great personality, very good at actually enthusing people, making everyone, for the lowliest guy standing guarding the front door to his deputies, with a sense of mission, and what they were doing was not only terrifically important to the war effort, but also great fun. You know, he's a fun guy. He's also a massive egomaniac. He's towering guy, and he's determined that he's going to come out of this war as a sort of gilded hero, someone that's going to be remembered forever, not just in the British pantheon of heroes like Nelson and Wellington, but in world, it's a global conflict, and he's going to be a global hero. And he's pretty good at doing this. He's very well placed to do this because he's incredibly well connected. He's the second cousin of the king. He's grown up with the mighty. He's hobnobs with royalty and with Winston Churchill as a friend, etc. As a military man, he's actually pretty good on the technical stuff. So he was in the Royal Navy. Royal Navy is a very, very serious, very professional service, and he did well in that. He was in signals, which was actually a very important technical, not terribly glamorous, but terribly important, and he proved himself to be very good at that. What he wasn't good at, in fact, indeed, he was actually useless at, was commanding a ship in battle. So he starts the war as a commander of a...
Don't pull your punches, okay, Patrick. I mean...
It just gives him glimpse from one catastrophe to another, but in his extraordinary way, he comes out of these what basically cock-ups, which would have sunk a lesser man who wasn't as well connected as him, and actually gets awards and medals and mentions in dispatches and a lot of publicity, which he's very good at. So he's, I think the fact that he was able to do this just reinforced his sense that he was a man of destiny. And so when he decided he was going to do something, it was going to be a massive success. Even if it's a failure, it'll be a success for him. And if it actually, things look really bad, somehow he'll be able to slither out of the consequences, which is exactly what happened at Dieppe.
Well, slithering is always a useful skill for anyone in the higher levels of politics or the military. I want to, before we go further into Dieppe, I did want to touch on another scheme of, I don't know if it originated with Mountbatten, but it was supposed to be a combined operations scheme that you talk about in the book. And man, if you think Dieppe is crazy, Imperator, as it was called, there's a real humdinger of a crazy idea. I had never heard of it. You talk about it a little bit in this book. This is an even wilder operation. Can you just give us the short skinny on that operation? That was another sort of possible way in which Mountbatten thought he was going to have an impact.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you picked up on that, because Dieppe might have looked insane to our eyes, but it was only one of a number of pretty nutty proposals that were on the table, and Imperator was, I think, probably the least plausible one. And that basically was that they were going to send a large force, including an armoured component, which would be at the heart of it, which would cross the Channel, get ashore in occupied France, in the Pas de Calais, which was the most heavily defended part of the enemy coastline. They would then steam off to Paris, where they would drive around Paris. The tanks would drive around Paris, shooting up various military headquarters, turn around, drive all the way back to the coast, where they would be picked up by the Navy and then carried back across the Channel.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, I know. I mean, why didn't someone think of that earlier? That's a great idea. But really, it's astonishing just to read it. It comes up in meeting after planning meeting after planning meeting after planning meeting, and it's only when someone, Trafford Lee Mallory, who was actually involved in the Dieppe thing as well, where he's not a very highly thought of RAF officer, regarded as being rather stupid, but he's the only one that actually says, "Look, hang on a minute, guys. Look, if I was the Luftwaffe commander in France, I'd be absolutely delighted to see these guys get ashore. And it would just be, a sort of dream come true. You just wait for them to trundle off towards Paris. They'd have to have tankers following them in order to refuel. He said, I wouldn't even bother shooting up the tanks. I'd just get my fighters to shoot up the tankers that are following them behind, the fuel trucks. They'd go up in flames. The tanks would grind to a halt. And so, so they eventually, with some reluctance, said, "Okay, you may have a point there."
Yeah.
When first challenged, when they were first challenged about, well, how were they going to, deal with the Luftwaffe on the way to Paris? And one of the chief planners in combined operations, one of Mountbatten's right-hand men, says, "Oh no, but they'd be going up these. I don't know if you've ever been to France, but in France, all the trees have poplars lining them, so the Air Force wouldn't be able to see the tanks." But there was that kind of level of.
That's why the Nazis were able to hide so well later on from the American Air Force.
Precisely.
Well, but this kind of leads to another question. As it pertains to this, but also the raid. Where are the adults in the room? I mean, one of the things that I find so striking is there are some people who we later read about having a major impact on operations in 1944. I'm thinking of Montgomery. I'm thinking of Brooke.
Yeah,
I'm thinking of people who we tend to look at as militarily competent. What's their role in this, and why aren't they just kind of patting Mountbatten on the head, saying, "That's nice. Now just go sit down, please"? They don't stop it.
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, Montgomery's role is very odd in this whole thing. At the time, he's in command of the southeast area, which is very important because it's actually opposite. It's the nearest point to occupied France. But he doesn't really. He's of the view that there's no point in doing anything until we're ready to actually launch the big one. And in the meantime, the best thing we could do is train. So he's obsessed with training. He's very, very good at training, and he's also got this kind of First World War memory of what happens in trench warfare. So he's determined to avoid another kind of massacre. You might say, okay, in that case, why did he sort of give the nod to Dieppe? His role in the whole thing is he's sort of very much at the pinnacle of the sort of command thing, but he's got a kind of oversight role rather than actually making plans or anything like that. Right. He's very preoccupied with his training. A lot of these things actually never happen, So if you've got to put yourself in the circumstances of the time. So as we've discussed, there've been various other schemes on the table which most of them actually never get beyond the drawing board. So it's quite possible that he just thought, this is never going to happen. I'll just kind of go along with it. And indeed, when it does, there's a first attempt made in early July, which is then cancelled because of the weather, at which point Montgomery says, okay, I think that's it, job, the whole thing is over and it should be cancelled for all time. He uses those words and then is promptly sent off to Egypt because he's given command of the army there.
That's actually one of the most fascinating parts of the story. Is this thing is dead? They were going to go in July. It's dead. Yeah. It's died, and then somehow it rises from the dead, and that causes its own set of problems, right? Because of security, etc.
But that's largely that's where Mountbatten becomes absolutely the villain. If there is a villain in the story, it's Mountbatten because he is actually dead in the water. It's only because he insists on resurrecting it, and with all the tremendous kind of political clout that he can bring to bear, that the thing gets resurrected. And it must be said, the Canadian brass bear quite a lot of responsibility as well, because you've got the two senior Canadians in Britain, McNaughton and Crerar, who are very keen to get their guys into action. And even though, people have been pointing out that there's huge flaws in the plan all along the line. And instead of just breathing a sigh of relief, thinking we may have dodged a massive disaster here, they go along with Mountbatten and say, yeah, we'll do it again. The plan isn't substantially re-altered. The whole question of security, which you brought up, surely the Germans must have known, they must have seen from the regular reconnaissance flights, there was a big build-up there that something was planned. Surely that means that it's in security terms, the thing is blown. It's no longer viable. But Mountbatten turned that round and said, but if you think about it, even if the Germans do get to hear what was planned and that Dieppe was the target, they'll never think we're crazy enough to do the same thing all over again.
This sounds like an episode of the Blackadder.
It does. It's like a cunning plan. But I think when it comes to Brooke, I've never actually been terribly impressed by Brooke. I mean, he was by British military standards, he was quite smart, but that wasn't actually saying a huge amount.
I'm with you, but I think this is.
I think he was again, there was a lot going on. I think this is a very small item on his agenda. So I think he can be forgiven for actually not paying too close attention.
Lowering the boom. Yeah. So one of the, obviously we're going to kind of get into this, but there are so many of these little kind of myths of Dieppe that you unpack for us in the book, which I just find fascinating. And one of the ones that I've always been told is, well, we had to let the Canadians lead this raid because they were just so anxious to go in there and fight. We just couldn't control them anymore. And, in the light of day, it sounds ridiculous. And you kind of have some wonderful quotes. There's a soldier named Dennis Whitaker who says, I'm not going to throw my life away. I'm here and I'm defending Britain because that's my job and I'll go where I'm sent, but I'm not going to just, so I guess at this point it's probably important. How do the Canadians get so involved? Why does it become the Canadian mission? And what is there to this idea that, well, we just had to send the Canadians because they just wanted to go fight somebody?
Well, I think there was a certain amount of lobbying went on by Crerar and Macnaghten, because they wanted
the generals.
they wanted Canada. Yeah, these are the two senior generals in Britain at the time, and they're very important political figures. They've got the ear. They basically tell Ottawa, they tell the government in Canada what is going to happen, and there's very little pressure coming back from the other side of the Atlantic on them to actually justify their actions. They're interesting psychological studies, because they were both artillery officers who served in the First World War alongside the Brits, and the general kind of mood in Canada changed after the First World War, away from deference towards the mother country, away from just unthinkingly following orders given by British superiors. And there's a kind of, the same pacifistic mood that infected the rest of Europe, and indeed of the combatant world after the First World War, against war, horror of war. So in Canada, you've got this kind of feeling between the wars of, okay, we're not going to get dragged into another British war on the continent about stuff that really hasn't got very much to do with us. But of course, when the war comes, all those old attitudes of the kind of move towards more independent thinking, more kind of, self-esteem, if you like, a growth in self-esteem, that all kind of seems to just evaporate. Yeah. And people like Crerar and Macnaghten, who were very distinguished in the First World War, they proved themselves over and over again, and they were at least the intellectual and professional equals of the guys that were now in charge of them, their sort of superiors in Britain. They then revert to showing this sort of almost pathetic deference towards their British betters. So when they're incredibly eager to please, and they're always offering the services of their troops. So I think that they have something to answer for on this question. I think they didn't push themselves forward, and the Canadian troops were very well trained. And so they thought, okay, there aren't any troops around in Britain who've actually known anything apart from defeat. There were some veterans of Dunkirk there, but that was hardly a great preparation for another action. So let's use these Canadians. They're in the right place. They're all posted along the Sussex, Kent, Hampshire border, coastline rather. So it did sort of make sense. But the idea, which was put out later, that the Canadian troops themselves were raring to go, champing at the bit, getting into fights in pubs because they weren't being let loose on the Germans. That is such nonsense. I'm sure we all know soldiers, and we know that soldiers, soldiers want to test themselves in battle, but they are not, by and large, lunatics who will go into any kind of scrap that's offered to them. They will get into just for the hell of it. It's not like that. I mean, the only reason that soldiers fight, or actually are eager to get on with a fight, is in order to shorten the conflict and get home again, get back to their families and loved ones and all the rest of it. So I think this was something that was put around in the way that that kind of jingoistic press coverage was put around after the event, and they picked on one incident I think it was in the summer of 1941, when the Canadian Prime Minister visited the troops in Aldershot, and he was booed by them, and the interpretation put on it by the journalists was, because they're raring to get into action and they feel that he's sort of somehow holding them back. Dennis Whittaker said, no, I was there. And the fact was, it was some kind of sports day was laid on for the Prime Minister's visit. And it was pouring down with rain, and the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, was delayed by 2 or 3 hours. So by the time that he actually turned up, they were all sodden and thoroughly ticked off, and so they were sort of booing. It was about that. It was nothing to do with, let us up the Nazis, when do we start, and I think I would have felt extremely resentful if I was a private soldier in the Canadian Army, to be portrayed as this sort of bloodthirsty lunatic. Didn't care what battle I was sent into, as long as it was a fight with the Germans.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting here with Patrick Bishop, who is the author of Operation Jubilee, Dieppe 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice. There's so many different questions to ask about the reason for this raid. We've touched on this a little bit. It's a kind of it's a sort of a slippery thing to get a hold of, and so a lot of theories have come up. And we had David O'Keefe on the show in August, writing about Dieppe, and he has a theory which you mentioned briefly in your book. And we have a bunch of people who've asked about this in our audience because they're all primed, having seen that show. He has a theory that this whole raid is basically cover for having a commando unit go in and steal an Enigma code machine to assist in the Bletchley Park code breaking. Makes a big deal out of the fact that Ian Fleming was there, and the commando unit was at Commando Unit 30. I'm not sure if that's correct. But what's your take on this whole theory? Because obviously that's something to consider and to have to deal with.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of admiration for David O'Keefe. I think he was an extremely good researcher. He's a good military historian, and he's come up with some very, very interesting stuff on 30 Assault Unit, or 30 Commando, as they were called, which indeed were created by Ian Fleming. He actually got the idea from the Germans and then ran with it, and 30 Assault Unit became very, very successful later on in the war. Their role in the Dieppe Raid was pretty slight. They didn't. I think one or two of them got ashore, but they were basically on a ship called a boat called the Locust, which ran into big troubles and didn't land. So, but the theory that this was really a cover, that if you want a simple explanation for Dieppe, it's a cover for this very secret pinch operation, as they were called, which is to get your hands on Enigma material, an Enigma machine, Enigma code books, and get them back to Britain, give them to the Bletchley Park people, where it's like gold dust. They'll be able to then break the codes with much greater speed, which will have a very significant material effect on the Battle of the Atlantic, which we have to remember is still going on in the background, but is still unwon, and is still actually has the potential to bring the war to an end in Germany's favor if the U-boats succeed. So it's an absolutely vital part of the war effort. So yeah, Enigma is central to what's going on. However, having said all that, I simply don't buy the idea that Dieppe is a huge sort of bit of camouflage to cover the real purpose of the raid. What you've got to bear in mind is that these pinch operations have been going on for some time. One of the early successes by the Mountbatten team was a raid on Vagsø, an island in the just off the Norwegian coast, where part of the plan was to blow up various facilities there, including fish oil tanks, which, believe it or not, were very important to the German war effort, but also to grab Enigma material. It was carried on German ships, even lowly vessels like a sort of armed trawler actually had Enigma material on board, maybe a machine, maybe code books or whatever. And so the Vagsø raid, a big component of that was actually getting some of this stuff. And when you read the plans for subsequent operations, some of which happened, some of which didn't, getting sensitive, highly sensitive intelligence material like that was built into the plan. And I think that's what the truth was with the Dieppe raid. Yeah, sure, if you read the orders, there are lots of references to getting hold of high-grade intelligence material. But that was just one element. There are lots of other objectives. I think that was just one objective of the raid. I think that attractive, though, because it's such a kind of difficult thing to explain, the raid, it is quite tempting to say, oh, well, there was a secret explanation for it. And I can see why David O'Keefe ran with that. But I think that in his enthusiasm, he's kind of lost sight of the fact that there are so many things that mitigate against that the sort of militate against that actually being the core reason for it. One thing that's occurred to me subsequently is that Mountbatten spent the rest of his life, I mean, after the raid, from the minute after the raid has become it's clear the raid is a disaster, he starts constructing explanations, justifications for it. And it's the one he famously came up with, which we'll probably come on to, is, oh, well, it was all a preparation for D-Day. This is all a rehearsal for D-Day. And he propagated that with great success, I have to say, right the way through to his death. Now, if there was the real reason had been that it was cover for a raid to grab this vital Enigma material, I'm sure Mountbatten would have cited that in his defense. Now, you might say, well, it was all meant to be a great secret, but by 1972, the Enigma story was known. It was broken in a book by a man called Winterbottom, who was an RAF officer who was actually part. He wasn't actually one of the code breakers. He disseminated the material. He wrote a book which got immediate attention, worldwide success, and it had legitimacy. People knew he wasn't some fabulist. He wasn't someone who was just making the stuff up. So that's when the mystery, the great secret of the war, the great secret of the Allied war, was revealed. So Mountbatten had another 7 years before he was murdered by the IRA. I'm sure that if that had been the real reason, he would have seized on that and said, I couldn't tell you before, but now that this secret is out, this is actually what Dieppe was about. Therefore, I am absolved. Please don't, regard me as being the villain of the piece.
Well, we love nothing more than a good literary feud here on History Happy Hour. So we'll set you and David up in a cage match.
I think he's a terrific writer. I'm just saying, I think
fair enough.
He's it's certainly caused a lot of controversy, and some people buy into it. I think most people probably don't. I think I'm probably on the side of the majority of Canadian military historians anyway, and saying, well, yeah, I mean, it's a nice idea, but probably not true.
So, Pat, people who've watched our show or know me know that I have something of a passionate interest in the Canadians, and I've read a lot about it and their involvement in the war. I tend to think they get overlooked quite a bit, and I thought before I read your book that I had a pretty good handle on Dieppe and what it was like. But one of the things that I found so moving and alarming and compelling about your book was the actual description of the raid itself and what was happening to those guys that are landing on the beach. So it's a big raid, and we won't get into all of it, but let's just strip aside all of these discussions we've had and to take Blue Beach as an example. Could you tell people watching what it's like for these kids that are landing on Blue Beach on that morning?
And can I just throw in, let's just throw the map up and say which one is Blue Beach here.
Yeah. Well, Blue Beach is just to the east of Dieppe, and it's one of the two landing points where the troops have to succeed. They have to get ashore. They have to move inland onto the heights overlooking the port itself in order to suppress the German guns, which look down on the main beaches and will, if they're left intact, will ensure that when the main landing goes in front of the town, it will be a massacre if those guns are still firing. So they've got a massively important job to do. However, they're coming in the expectation that darkness will provide a huge amount of security for them, and that the surprise of them bursting onto the shore just before dawn will be enough, and their élan, as the French would say, their kind of courage, their determination to get to the grips with the enemy, will be enough to overcome the immediate beach defences and then hook right up onto the heights and take the guns. It's a kind of mad idea from the beginning, because the intelligence that the planners had from the many air reconnaissance flights that were done beforehand show that there are a couple, there are at least sort of half a dozen machine guns covering that beach. Anyone who certain that on the Western Front in the First World War knew what half a dozen machine guns could do. They could hold up a whole battalion, massacre a whole battalion in a matter of minutes, or at least reduce them to absolute inoperability. Nonetheless, for the reasons we discussed before, because of this sort of inexorability that built up into the whole exercise, they do land. Now, I've been in quite a few wars myself. I'm not boasting, but I think I have a slight I've got a slight advantage in telling this story, in that I actually went ashore in the Falklands in a landing craft of World War II design. And so I can sort of, it doesn't take much imagination for me to sum up what a part at least of what they must have felt as you're going ashore. You have no idea what's going to happen when that bow door goes down. In my case, thank God, in our case, when I was with 42 Commando, there was no opposition except from the air. We had air attacks, but we had troops waiting to shoot at us. But it does sort of, you do realize when you're inside one of these things that basically you're providing a sort of frame. Once the bow door goes down, you're just framed there for the machine gunners to just pour their fire into this opening. And that's precisely what happened. So even for a start, the cover of darkness proved to be no protection at all. For one reason or another, they got there a little bit late. By then, a firefight at sea, there was a kind of clash between a German convoy and a flotilla of the invading armada, meant that there'd already been a sort of kerfuffle out to sea, which put people on the alert. So there's no element of surprise at all. So they get there, they're closing the shore in the dawn light. Bullets already clanging, not clanging off the landing craft, going straight through them. So people, you're standing there in the third or fourth row, guys around you already kind of crumpling and falling. The landing craft grounds on the gravel, a very heavy, pebbly beach, and immediately there's a torrent of fire. So the men in front of you are just tumbling, groaning, screaming, yelling. You can't go back, you can only go forward. So you're just walking straight into this blizzard of fire. Blue Beach was particularly terrible because it was a very narrow beach, and if you actually got onto the beach, you're then confronted with this enormous sea wall, which is covered completely by these German rapid-firing machine guns. So if you were in the third or fourth row, by the time if you do actually make it off the landing craft, you've just got to see a carpet of bodies, dead, dying, badly wounded, and this terrible cacophony of machine gun fire, shortly to be supplemented by mortar fire. So for the next, if you survive, your experience would have been to spend about 3 hours just lying there, trying to burrow into this penetrable, pebbly beach, while all around you is just this terrible din of battle interspersed with the screams of your wounded comrades. Terrible, terrible experience. And the photographs afterwards, well, I think anyone who's seen them will forget them.
It's just a disastrous raid in a lot of ways. I want to come back, if we can, to a question that has come up here, which is to what degree, how did the politicians handle the failure of Dieppe with the British and Canadian public? Was there a blowback? I know in the immediate days after, people don't quite realize. They know there's a lot of dead, but they maybe don't realize the whole scope of it. What kind of blowback is there in a longer term, and how was it handled?
Well, it was initially presented as a success, so in very vague terms. So the impression was given in Canada and in America. There's some American troops involved as well, only 100, but because it was a very early stage of the war, it's the first time America's actually seen action. It was quite a big news event. So it's presented as a success. That only lasts about, I don't know, maybe 12 hours maximum, because they know they can't actually stick with this story. So then it becomes translated into a heroism narrative. So in the Canadian papers particularly, there were a lot of Canadian war correspondents attached to the troops, and they did their bit, by the authorities, by just telling stories of individual heroism, of which there were very many. Some astonishing stories of bravery, almost unimaginable bravery. But then, of course, it's like, okay, well, why? What was it for? And that's when this was an experiment. This was a necessary sacrifice in order to gain vital experience, which will translate into success when the real landing comes, whenever that may be.
Can I jump in?
Right.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It's terribly rude of me.
Not at all. No.
No, but we do actually have a clip from Bowman, who is one of the Canadian correspondents there, and I think this is from the night of the 19th, or possibly from the next day, and it really illustrates what you're talking about. It's about a minute long of him talking, so I'd like to play that.
I'm broadcasting now about the Dieppe Raid at a time when details are just becoming available. I'd like to say this to you in Canada. We've suffered heavy losses, and I saw our men die, but never have I seen men die more bravely or fight with such great heart as our Canadian troops. The word Dieppe may rank with Vimy Ridge in our history. Our losses haven't been sustained without reason. We've learned a most valuable lesson which may enable us to free the continent of Europe and end the war. We know now how the German system of coastal defenses operates and how best to attack. We know the tremendous weight of artillery the enemy can bring to bear on the beaches. That was the purpose of the raid, as set out officially and told to us before we set sail: to destroy defenses and kill Germans and to obtain information. We did all those things which the Germans have never been able to do to us.
It's quite interesting that he says at the end, things that the Germans have never been able to do to us. And that was something that in the planning stages, various skeptics said, has it ever occurred to you guys that the Germans never launch raids across the Channel? And the reason they don't do that is because there's absolutely no point in it. And it goes back to the old trench raiding tradition of the First World War, which is something I think we've all read those accounts of trench warfare. And the Brits are always, okay, chaps, we're going out on a trench raid tonight. And it's you think, if I was there, I just think, why? Please let it not be me that's chosen. It's this kind of notion that somehow aggression is essential to keep up morale, But yeah, as you say, I mean, Bob Bowman does actually do what his. I'm not in any way impugning him as a war correspondent. I was a war correspondent myself. I know that propaganda is part of your job. If you start sort of, that's something you accept when you do it. If you're going to be going against the party line, you won't last very long as a war correspondent. But that illustrates perfectly how the narrative, as we would now say, was formed. And so that, particularly that last bit about we've learned invaluable lessons, again, a bit of common sense would tell you, well, surely we knew already that if you send a large, but not large enough, anything like large enough number of troops against strongly defended positions without having first destroyed or at least reduced those defensive positions by heavy air bombardment or heavy naval gunfire, then you're going to, the recipe is you're going to get a massacre. Anyone, a junior, lieutenant knows that. So why did it need to have a disaster to point out the obvious to the higher ups? But that, amazingly, that line proved very durable right up to the present day, people who still think that there was some virtue in it.
So, Patrick, you are, I guess you would say, unique in that you can bring to this story not only your skill as a historian, but also your experience as a war correspondent. You spent a lot of time around soldiers. You spent a lot of time studying the military at various levels. As you were researching this book, is there anything that surprised you or shocked you? Well, maybe not shocked, but that surprised you about the raid?
Well, I think it's that thing of something that is so patently a bad idea, being able to sort of get legs and become sort of unstoppable. But it surprised me at first, but then when I thought about it more, it became more understandable. And I do always try and put myself in the shoes of the people that are making the decisions, that are actually having to do the fighting and all the rest of it. And I think you've got to remember that war, a lot of things are happening at the same time, and even though very few people have actually got the agency to stop something, but they're always collective efforts. I think in this particular case, there was a kind of gamble. There was a kind of for the people at the very top, the people who bear the most responsibility, there was a kind of reputational gamble at stake. And I think because there was sort of so many cooks involved in this particular broth, that it was quite easy for people to think, okay, well, if it does go wrong, my fingerprints aren't really all over it. Mountbatten is who probably looks most guilty. And if it goes right, then I can take some credit for it. I think that's something that often happens it happens in every sphere of life, doesn't it? And it's particularly true in warfare, except the difference being that people's lives are at stake.
Well, when things go right on this show, I always think it's because of me, and if things go poorly, Patrick, it's because of you. But I wanna actually pick up on Chris's comment there, and as he mentioned up front as well, you're not simply a historian. And as you mentioned, you're somebody who has literally landed in a landing craft on a beach. I was struck, there was one paragraph in your book, a passage that I want to read to you and ask about. And you say, inside every head the same tussle was going on, and the same opposing emotions clicked backwards and forward with the regularity of a metronome. And this is as people are getting ready to land. The tick of excitement at the prospect of finding out at last what battle is really all about, and whether your courage was a match for it, was followed by the talk of fear, of death, maiming, or worst of all, some hideous loss of control and the lifetime stigma of cowardice. And when I read that, Patrick, I thought that paragraph must really come from your own experience. It just sounded so visceral. And I wonder, you've touched on it a little bit, but how much that personal experience enables you to understand and to put into words what goes on in battle, which, as we all know, or at least, as I assume, is something that is almost impossible to convey to people who aren't there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you like that passage, because I did sort of when I wrote it, I thought, it's very rare when you're writing, you actually think, oh, boom, I've got it, I've got it. And that, so it sounds as if I'm boosting. I thought actually that sums up what I felt myself many times in various situations. But particularly the first time I went to war, I was in the Falklands, as I said earlier, and on the way down, we were never sure we were actually going to be in a war at all, because there was all this diplomatic stuff going on in the background. So it took a long time to get down to the Falklands. I was on the Canberra with the Marines and the Paras, and we'd listened to the radio. That radio was piped into the ship, so you heard hourly bulletins from the BBC about what was going on the diplomatic front. And so when the things were going badly, put it the other way around. When things were going well, you thought, even though there's this sort of sense of foreboding hanging over the whole enterprise. But when you hear, oh, we may be turning around and going back home again, there's a sort of tremendous sort of deflationary effect, and you think, oh, I'll never get to find out whether those things I mentioned, whether you actually be able to stand up to the rigors of battle, whether you bottle it, this terrible fear of showing yourself up in front of your comrades. I think that's what keeps people going a lot. And then, of course, the next bulletin, they say the talks are now broken down, and the war is glowing. Prospects of war have just grown again. And then you suddenly start thinking about, oh my God, am I going to come out of this alive, etc., etc. But there is a kind of there's also a kind of excitement. I mean, there is a kind of, whatever you think about it, some terrible thing in men particularly, overwhelmingly, that you do want to be able to, Shakespeare got it. You want to be able to say to your children, I was there, and those who weren't will, when you're telling the story, are going to feel slightly diminished. So they're all some ignoble. There's always a tremendous sort of tussle between noble and ignoble thoughts, fear and self-preservation against the desire for adventure and to prove yourself. And something I've always felt about soldiers is that I don't think people see it unless they've actually been alongside them in a kind of intimate capacity with danger involved. But there's a tremendous tenderness. They have a terrific kind of affection for each other, and which you can only really call love. And I think that's really what is the most essential ingredient in the kind of atmospherics of fighting. That people are not fighting for cause, they're not fighting for their generals, they're not fighting for some ideal, that they're just fighting in support of the guys on either side of them. And that's what produces the heroics. That's what makes men leave cover, which you saw at Dieppe over and over again. What little cover there was, men would leave it, walk crawling out into a maelstrom of bullets to drag back a wounded combat, and often get killed in the process. I mean, there's something, whatever you think about war, there's something tremendously moving and noble about that, I think.
So Pat,
go ahead, Chris.
So
You
Patrick,
and wrap it up here.
Yeah, no, I guess one of the things that I would kind of like to get your thoughts on, I had a chance to ask you this when I heard you speak about the book earlier, but I think for the benefit of our guests,
our audience.
The audience, yes. Obviously, the raid is just about unknown in America. It's known a little bit in Great Britain, but it looms pretty large in Canadian history. What impact did this raid have on Canada's sense of self, its attitude towards being part of the empire, and how is it remembered today in Canada?
You would have thought that there would be a huge kind of political row as a consequence of this, with the Canadian government asking the Brits, or demanding from the Brits, explanations about why their men were sent into this appalling, unwinnable situation. It didn't work out like that. I think, again, you've got to take into account the dynamics of wartime. It's not the time to have a huge row. Things are moving on. It's not going to actually, you're not going to gain anything from it. So the Canadian government was remarkably reticent and understanding about the British point of view. Subsequently, there's a war to win, and I think there was a recognition on the British side that they had to give the Canadians more responsibility for their own actions, give them more kind of command power, if you like. And that happened to an extent, so that by the time you get to in Italy and in Normandy, the Canadians really they seem to get on pretty well. Montgomery actually, despite the fact behind their backs he's quite cutting, he does actually give them a sort of the commanders a fair crack at controlling their own destinies, and they come out of Normandy tremendously well. They have a terrific campaign there. And if you look at it, the casualties are much, I don't know how you put it exactly, but they are very small compared to what happened in Dieppe. So the whole of the Normandy campaign, 5,000 soldiers are killed against 600 soldiers killed in a couple of hours. So the Normandy campaign lasted how many weeks? 10 weeks or something. So in 10 weeks they lost 5,000. In 5 hours they lost 600. So it's a good result.
Well, we want to thank you, Patrick Bishop, for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, Operation Jubilee, Dieppe, 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice. It's a terrific book.
Absolutely.
I think both Chris and I agree, and so thank you so much for writing it. It was a pleasure to read, and thank you for chatting about it with us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed it. It's a great podcast, and really nice to talk to you.
Thank you. We'll put that on our website.
That's right. Endorsed by.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much, Pat. Take care.
Thank you so much. You too.
Yes.
Okay, Chris. So that was awesome, and he mentioned Shakespeare, and I know that quote.
You do. You've heard it somewhere before.
Gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed. They were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day.
You're trying to like act all smart.
That's I have the vest. It's not me.
You got the vest. Okay.
It's the vest.
It all just
the
vest.
Exudes, the vest exudes it, and when I wear this vest, I feel the power, as I imagine you do with that tie.
I do.
So, Chris, tell us about what we have coming up next week, and because it's an invasion of it's more Canada. I don't know. We're all Canada all the time now. I'm not sure what's going on.
Well, this has to be one of the most unusual stories in both Canadian and American history. It is the story of the invasion of Union Army veterans of Irish descent of Canada in an attempt to overthrow British rule in Ireland. So
yeah, because that will work. That is almost as crazy as the Dieppe Raid.
Dieppe Raid, right? But it's a fascinating story. So
it is an amazing story, and it's actually not just Union, right? I think it's Union and Confederate Civil War, Irish Civil War veterans, because a perfect plan is we'll hold Canada hostage to make England give up Ireland. What can go wrong?
Join us next week so we try to figure this one out.
No, that's amazing. And I do want to just briefly mention also that we are doing a book giveaway, because the following week we're having on Charles Person, who was one of the Freedom Riders back in the 1960s, and he's written a book called The Buses Are A-Comin', and we are doing a giveaway on our Patreon page. Let's see if I can't throw up that link there, where we're giving away one book. This is awesome. We're giving away one book in Europe and one book in the United States. And so if you want to be part of that, you can check that link on our Patreon page. You don't have to be a patron. You do probably have to sign up for Patreon, but go there, just reply to the blog post, and maybe you'll be the winner of the book, and we're looking forward to having him on as well. So that's fantastic. So we don't want to forget mentioning that. And the deadline on that, for those of you who are thinking about doing it, is Tuesday midnight Eastern Standard Time. So another great show, Chris. Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
See you next week. Be safe, everyone.
Oh, hang on. Push the right button, Rick. Wait a minute. What's happening? It's like we had a week off. I can't remember anymore.